everyone, and welcome to We Go Back. I'm your host, Bryan Abou Chacra, and on this week's episode, we will be reviewing Jughead and the Little Prince, the third and fourth episodes from Season 5 of Lost. We open up to the birth of Charlie, Penny and Desmond's kid, and I'm bringing this up because we have now seen 3 babies born of people who were on the island. We have Aaron, Gian, and Desmond and Penny's child. Very interesting to see their legacy. We do find out that Desmond is going to go through with Daniel's request to go to Oxford and try to find his mother to try to save everybody on the island. Now we'll go to the jungle where we find that Daniel does know what's happening to Charlotte, but he says that he won't let it. I think that he has been through this before, whether it was with the rat Eloise or all the other rats that we find out later in the episode he's killed, and as well with the woman that he affected. But we'll get to that in just a moment. In this same scene, we see Locke realizing that the gun they've been carrying is an M1 Garand rifle, which was the standard issue service rifle in World War II and the Korean War. So this is giving you hints on where about in time they are within a 10-year span of the 1940s and 50s. We also hear the prisoners speaking to each other in Latin, and we find out from Juliet that all of the others learn Latin because it is the language of the enlightened, but it's also one of the oldest languages. That's the base for several other languages like Spanish, Italian, and French. And if you think about the age of Richard and the comments we've heard so far about him being old, it's very interesting that they are speaking Latin on the island. Moving along, when Desmond returns to Oxford to try to find Daniel Faraday, there is no sign or record of him at all. He has been expunged from their history until he finds Daniel's old laboratory, which has been quarantined off. And one of the groundskeepers talks about all of the experiments and all of the dead rats and tells us about Teresa, who was the poor woman affected by Daniel's research, since he was live testing on humans as well. We find out that he was doing these experiments to try to unstick her mind from time, but just like all of the rats, she seems to be suffering from the same thing that Minkowski was. We know that her mind is unstuck, but she's not unstable enough to where she's dying. And we do also find out that she's being kept alive by Widmore, who is Daniel's benefactor the entire time, and he's been taking care of Teresa. Now, a small theme to bring up here that's very important to notice is that Desmond is dealing with Daniel's cowardice in this scene. He's seeing another man run away from his problems like Desmond was doing his entire life. Let's return to the island where we see one of the others snap the neck of his colleague when he tries to help the survivors of Flight 815. This is very important because it seems to call back to when Mikael and Miss Clue had their conversation about knowing what needs to be done. It seems to suggest that the others are instructed to kill one another if they're being held captive. And though Locke has a bead on the person running away, he chooses not to shoot him. And as we find out later in the episode, this is a very important decision by John, which affects the rest of their lives. But we'll get to that in just a moment. First, I want to mention the bit of humor when we find that man runs back to the camp. He comments that their leader is an old man who wouldn't possibly know the island better than he does. And I think that's hilarious, given that it almost seems like Locke was designed to know the island. We even saw him give away his compass to Saeed at one point because he said he no longer needs it and has that much of a familiarity with the island. So let's talk a little bit about what Alpert tells Daniel when he says that the chain of command made them kill the U.S. Army. They gave them the opportunity to leave the island peacefully, and when they wouldn't, the chain of command told them to wipe them out. This is absolutely mirroring the same decision that Ben had to make when he wiped out the Dharma Initiative. So we've now heard reference to different leadership of the others on the island throughout time. Let's now jump back to when Desmond finally confronts Widmore again. We see that it leads him back to Widmore's office, and upon entering the office, he gets a unique designation. Widmore calls him his colleague, and I think that that's a very interesting thing to call him because he really doesn't have to give any information or explain himself to his staff. So I think that has something to tie into that we'll get to as we go on through season 5 and 6. It'll be a lot of fun to touch back. He does find out that Daniel Faraday's mother is in Los Angeles, and he's only asked one question by Widmore. He wants to know if his daughter is safe. We all remember what Ben had promised to do to her if he ever found her, so Widmore says wherever you were hiding, go back to there and make sure you're never found again, because he wants to protect his daughter. And speaking of Widmore, we actually met a young Widmore back in the camp when he was part of the others. So we now know that Widmore's comment from the previous season about standing on the shoulders of everything he's built comes from him being on the island at a young age. And it's really cool to see John stand up to him and Richard by throwing his weight around and telling them exactly why he's here, because he's sent by Jacob. This also explains why Locke didn't shoot Widmore when he ran away, because he simply can't kill him. It would create a time paradox, which is absolutely impossible. We know from Daniel's comments that whatever happened, happened. And in the next episode, this ties in really well for both Locke and Sawyer when they are faced with seeing part of their past. Speaking of time paradoxes, we are faced with a pretty interesting moment when Locke hands Alpert the compass that he was given in the previous episode. But if you think about it, Alpert doesn't seem to know where it comes from, so this means he's getting it for the first time. Where does this compass originate? Locke only got it from Alpert and then gave it back to Alpert in the past. He thought it would somehow convince Richard of who he was, but he ends up telling Richard, if you don't believe who I am, I'll be born in 2 years. Come visit me and you'll see that I am who I say I am. And that's why Richard Alpert was there visiting Locke when he was born. It's also why we saw Richard give him a compass as part of the Dalai Lama test. It's really great to see all of these pieces stitched together throughout the show without it having to be a big ordeal. The way this show was written really could confuse a lot of people because it didn't hold your hand through a lot of stuff. And that's why upon repeated viewings, it really helps to clarify what's going on in the show. Lost is really like a great novel where there's so much detail, and when you go through it again and you go through it with a fine-tooth comb, you'll find a lot of reasons and motivations and explanations. And this will take us into Little Prince, where we open up to Kate and Jack on the boat, and we find out that Kate actually chose to keep Aaron, and that's how she got custody of him. And in this episode, we also see how important Kate actually has been to Aaron his entire life. Even though she may not be his biological mother, there have been a lot of ties to them throughout the entire time they've been together. We now return to the island where Juliet finally gets Daniel to explain what is happening to Charlotte. He explains that it's basically like bad jet lag and that her brain can't process all of these jumps through time because it knows that it's not in the right place. This also forces Locke to realize that he has to go to the Orchid Station to fix this problem because everything started once Ben turned that wheel, and realizes and accepts that even if it kills him, he has to try to bring all of them back. Meanwhile, in the future, people are still after Saeed, and we find out that one of them is after Kate. But while all of this is all going on, we realize every single member of the Oceanic Six happens to all be in LA at once, almost as if they were all designed to be. We now return to the island where we see Locke on one of his worst nights of his life, beating on the hatch door and asking what to do next. A man who used to be lost and didn't accept his fate before this. Everything surrounding the hatch had to do with uncertainty, and it wasn't until the hatch blew up that Locke really started to embrace that the island had him here for a reason. And it's also the night that Aaron was born, and we get to see Sawyer watch Kate help give birth to Aaron. And this is where we see that Kate has been there his entire life. And this leads us into a great conversation between Locke and Sawyer, talking about needing the pain that they went through back then to get to where they are now. This is almost referencing the conversation that Locke had with Charlie, talking about growth, that if you were to help the moth get out of its cocoon, it would never grow up to be strong. And that's why we spent 3 seasons delving really deeply into all of these characters' pasts and why they are who they are. So when they realize that the fastest way to get to the Orchid is by going around the island, they return to the beach to try to take the Zodiac. What they find there, however, is 2 canoes much like the ones they used to get off of Hydra Island, but inside of it, they see a water bottle from Ajira Airways. And they find their old camp in ruins, as if it had been a while since anybody had been there. Now, before I get to the end of this episode, I want to talk about the meeting at the pier, where everybody from the Oceanic 6 just happens to all be there, and we find out that Ben was the one trying to get the sample from Kate and Aaron to prove that she isn't his actual mother. I think that this is underlying all of the story, showing that Ben is somehow still able to pull the strings for all of these characters from the background, since pretty much all of them, except for Hurley, are here. And then we get to our final scene in the episode, where we actually get to observe Russo's team and their wreckage and how they got to the island. And one of the craziest finishes of an episode, especially as we're traveling through all of these different time periods, we see that Jin is still alive, and he's introduced to Russo. So these 2 episodes really throw a lot at you in terms of the concept of time travel and what their effect in that time is. Because we need to remember that whatever happened, happened. And even in Sawyer's conversation with Juliet about why he didn't talk to Kate when he saw her giving birth to Aaron, he says what's done is done, which mirrors the sentiment of Daniel's theme. He knows he actually can't change it, especially after his conversation with Locke about needing to get here by going through the pain that they've gone through. Guys, that'll take us into the end of the episode. Next week, we will be reviewing This Place's Death and 316. Email me your thoughts, theories, and questions to wegobackpodcast@gmail.com. Love hearing from you guys. Follow me on Twitter @KingLordBryan. And until next episode, see you soon.